Hi guys, I love road trips. I'm taking a road trip, a 300-mile road trip. This one without Sarah, so I'm doing this solo. I'm going to check out the San Fernando Mission Cemetery in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California. And there's a list of famous people that I'm going to try to locate the graves of. And I thought I would just kind of introduce kind of what I'm doing this way as I travel up and down Highway 99. There's probably about 20-30 names. I know this cemetery is full of people who had an association with the entertainment industry. There's some big names and some interesting folks. A lot of Disney voice character actors are down there buried. And one of my favorites, we got to be finding the grave of Clarence Ducky Nash, who was the original voice of Donald Duck. I corresponded with Mr. Nash at one point in the 80s, I believe it was, and he was gracious enough to send me some autographs through the mail, so I hope to pay my respects to Mr. Nash. All right, so I have made it to the San Fernando Catholic Mission Cemetery here in San Fernando Valley. It's very windy today. We're going to start out finding the grave of Laurie Anders, who is a voluptuous blonde who was well known for just one thing back in the 1940s. She is right here. Her last name is Radaz, or Radetz. She lived from 1922 to 1992, so that made her 70 years old. Laurie Anders was a voluptuous blonde starlet who enjoyed brief fame as a crooning cowgirl on the Ken Murray Show on CBS TV from 1950 to 1953. Her hit theme song was "I Love the Wide Open Spaces."
Cowboy! I like the wide open spaces, out where the captain's grave, where 2 guns beat 4 aces. I like the wide open spaces.
And I think she would love it here as well. It became a popular catchphrase of that era. Anders brought her character to the big screen as the star of The Marshal's Daughter in 1953, which Time magazine called one of the worst westerns ever made, and it's considered somewhat of a camp classic. Once the novelty act wore off, Anders found little work and left show business in the late 1950s. Right over here, to the left of this statue of Jesus, right about over there, is the grave of inventor Lee DeForest, who was known as the father of radio. After he passed away in 1961, he was buried right here on this spot. Now, curiously, the marker makes mention of Marie, his wife, but her birth year and her death year have not been etched onto this marker. She was his 4th wife. All indications are that she's buried here. She died in 1983, so that was like 22 years after he died. It was his experiments in 1906 that led to the invention of what's called the Audion vacuum tube, which allowed for a voice to be amplified. 1 year later, he applied for a patent for an improved tube called a triode that he dubbed the DeForest valve. He was one of America's pioneer radio station owners. In fact, in 1916, he broadcast the first radio advertising, which was for his product, and was the first to report presidential election results on the radio. He also led the first radio broadcast of music. To top it off, he was credited with inventing talking movies. In fact, in 1959, he was awarded an Academy Award for his pioneering inventions, which brought sound to the motion picture. So I'm pretty excited to find this grave over here. It's of a well-known Western actor. Walter Brennan is right underneath this large oak tree. I think it's an oak tree. His grave is right here. He's buried here with his wife, Ruth. If you don't know him, he was an amazing guy. He had an extensive career in Hollywood. Became famous as the Judge Roy Bean in The Westerner in 1940. He was also nominated for his performance in Sergeant York in 1941. He enjoyed a range of roles, but he was best known in Westerns. He appeared with John Wayne in Red River in 1948.
It's 1,000 miles to Missouri, ain't it?
That's right.
You figure me and my bad leg couldn't ride a horse yet?
That's it.
Well, it might be I could ride a chuck wagon.
We've already got a cook.
That is right, Mr. Dunson. But might be old Cookie might not like grubbing the trip all that way. You heard me good that time, didn't you? Well, I might be able to persuade him. It might be just the time of year when old cookie like a change of scenery could be persuaded. It might be they're already persuaded because he happened to quit this morning.
In Rio Bravo, 1959, and was memorable as Old Man Clanton in My Darling Clementine, 1946. He was in a number of other films, including The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1938, Pride of the Yankees, 1942, Bad Day at Black Rock, 1955, How the West Was Won in 1962. That was a big one. It seems like a really unlikely place for a Western movie star to be buried. You would expect him to be buried out somewhere in the plains of Texas or Arizona. And boy, the wind is sure kicking up. Now, if you were a kid sometime in the 1950s or 60s, you probably remember him in the Novello 1967 film. A little bit corny, I think. So now we're going to try to find the grave of Jerry Colonna. So right over here is one of the graves that I absolutely wanted to find. It's that of Jerry Colonna, a famous actor, comedian, singer, and composer. Probably best remembered for his popping eyes and screeching voice as the popular foil for comedian Bob Hope on those USO tours during World War II, as well as Korea and Vietnam Wars. During the 1930s and 40s, he was a favorite on the Bob Hope radio show as Professor Colonna, during which he needled Hope with insults and gags. He was in several of Bob Hope's road movies and was the voice of March Hare in the classic 1951 Walt Disney feature Alice in Wonderland. A stroke in 1966 kind of sent his health spiraling downward. 1979 had a heart attack. He died of kidney disease in 1986. This is the grave of Betty Compson Gall, who's one of those silent film stars whose fame has faded since she was on the silver screen a century ago. She received an Academy Award for the Best Actress nomination for The Barker, 1928. Betty made her vaudevillian debut at age 15 and broke into films in 1950. Can you believe that? 117 years ago. She also performed in slapstick comedies, westerns, and serials. In 1919, she appeared in the melodrama The Miracle Man with Lon Chaney, which made her one of Hollywood's reigning leading ladies. Compson's career peaked in 1928 with The Docks of New York as a vulnerable and blazingly sexy waterfront prostitute who was rescued from suicide by a brutish sailor. When movies developed sound, she adopted well to talkies and worked steadily as a supportive player through 1948, but in her later years, she ran a store making and selling earthenware pottery. Now I'm going to try to find the grave of Chuck Connors. I don't know about you, but if you grew up in the 60s, you probably know who Chuck Connors is. He was the rifleman.
The Rifleman. Starring Chuck Connors.
There he is. Chuck Connors, he appeared in over 40 films, but his greatest fame was as the TV rifleman. He had a fine performance as Burl Ives' worthless son in The Big Country in 1958, which led to a starring role as a rifleman. It was a top-rated TV show in its first season, in which he played Lucas McCain, a New Mexico homesteader raising his son on his own and keeping peace with his trusty Winchester. The series ran from 1958 to 1963 and had an international following. So Chuck Connors was a friend of President Nixon, and when he was a guest at Nixon's house there in San Clemente in Southern California, the occasion was the visit of Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. And when Mr. Brezhnev saw Chuck Connors, he gave him a big bear hug because he was a fan of riflemen, even from Russia, believe it or not. So across this wide expanse of green grass in Section J is a forgotten performer by the name of Olga San Juan. Her marker shows her with her married name of O'Brien. She was married to actor Edmund O'Brien, but they divorced, so he's not buried here. She was actually known as Hollywood's Island Princess of the 1940s and 50s, and also as the Puerto Rican Pepper Pot, appearing as a dancer and singer in several movies, often musicals. They included Rainbow Island in 1944 and Duffy's Tavern 1945. She often played a cute and spunky antagonist to other leading ladies, and she reached the height of her success dancing with Fred Astaire in Blue Skies in 1946.
Babaloo,
So right here is the grave of Dick Foran. He's probably best known as a singing cowboy, but he was very versatile in his movie roles, appearing in a wide category of movies from horror, comedies, dramas, musicals, and westerns spanning from the 1930s through the 1960s, performing in over 200 movies with such stars as James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, John Wayne, and Shirley Temple. Although always billed as a prophetic B actor, he received an Oscar nomination, Best Supporting Actor, for his role in The Petrified Forest in 1936. Warner Brothers featured him as their answer to Republic's Gene Autry in Champion, Roy Rogers in Trigger, in a series of B-westerns featuring a horse called Smoke, billed as the Wonder Horse, and he is the singing cowboy. Among his better roles were the Fighting 69th, Fort Apache, and Donovan's Reef. So quite by coincidence, I came across this grave of Michael Maltese. He was a renowned cartoon writer for Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, and Hanna-Barbera. While he worked for the famous cartoon directors Fritz Freleng and Tex Avery, he did most of his memorable stories for the legendary Chuck Jones to create some of the most popular characters of all time, including the Roadrunner, the Coyote, and Yosemite Sam. He later went on to help create some storylines for classic TV cartoons such as The Flintstones, Huckleberry Hound, and Quick Draw McGraw. You might remember those. Right here is the grave that I just was delighted to find because it has something special on it. It's the grave of Clarence Nash, who was the original voice of Donald Duck, and he's buried right here. He was born in Oklahoma, best known for being the original voice of Donald Duck. In 1934, he began his career as a sound man for Walt Disney Studios when he created the voice for Donald Duck. For the next 50 years, besides voicing Donald Duck, he also supplied the voices for Donald's nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, plus his girlfriend Daisy Duck. Clarence Nash died of leukemia at the age of 80 in Burbank in 1985. It's a pretty amazing grave when you consider the fact that his claim to fame was Donald Duck, Daisy Duck, and there they are engraved on his grave marker.
Did you have to audition for Walt Disney?
Well, he happened to hear me on a radio program. And he heard me doing all my imitations, and little Mary reciting Mary Had a Little Lamb. Later on, it quacked like a duck.
Yeah.
And that suggested a new character for him.
You're also the voice of Huey, Dewey, and Louie.
That's right.
Good morning, Huey. You're going to be a good boy today? I'll try to.
This is always sobering to watch. Bring another vault in for another burial. Beautiful little monument here with Christ in the center of it. There's a mausoleum back here. And back here is somebody I want to show you. This is J. Novello, 1904 to 1982, and his wife, Patricia, beloved wife. If you're an Andy Griffith fan, you probably remember the episode where Mayberry is celebrating an event and they want to honor a guest, and J. Novello drives into town. He's a thief, he's a pickpocket, and they honor him. They put him up in the hotel, and he ends up ripping off half the town. He also played an episode as an opportunist lawyer in Otis Sues the County. He also appeared in countless TV series such as I Love Lucy, The Millionaire, Zorro, 77 Sunset Strip, McHale's Navy, and Family Affair. Now a little ways to the left of the statue of Mary is this actor and comedian, George Goble, best remembered for his Lonesome George image and his clean-cut humor during the early years of TV in the 1950s. The marker here mentions his military service as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. Of course, this was before the Air Force branch was created.
I was a pilot during the war. You remember the war? It was in all the papers. And
I read it. I'm encouraging it.
Well, I told you about that the last time I was on your show, you know, but I fought the whole war in Oklahoma. And,
So what you say?
I don't know why people laugh when I say that, you know, because that's evidently where they needed me or they wouldn't have sent me.
Looks like George died in 1991. I remember he always wore those flat-top haircuts. He had a pretty mild-mannered comic delivery. Started out in TV in 1952. He had his own show, The George Goble Show, in 1954. And for the next 5 years, his show was one of the top on TV. After his show was canceled in 1959, he was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, The Jack Benny Show, The Dinah Shore Show, and The Ed Sullivan Show. Well, to me, it's disappointing that her name is not on this marker, but this is the gravesite of Penny Singleton, best known as Blondie Bumstead in the many Blondie movies, popular in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950. She was actually a brunette who dyed her hair for the part. You may also know that Penny was the voice of Jane Jetson on the Jetsons cartoon series starting 1962. So her sister is June McNulty Flynn, whose name is on this marker. Penny's birth name was Mariana Dorothy McNulty, and she's also buried right here next to her parents, Bernard and Mary McNulty. Singleton appeared in many other films, including After the Thin Man in 1936, Good News 1930, Racket Busters 1938, The Best Man 1964, and Go West Young Lady 1941. She also starred in TV shows such as Murder, She Wrote, The Twilight Zone, and Death Valley Days. Here's the grave of Ed Begley Sr. 1970 is when he passed away. He often was cast as a corrupt or misguided authority figure. Ed Begley Sr. appeared in over 250 TV shows and about 35 movies, typically as a villain you didn't like. He won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for the role as Boss Finley in the film Sweet Bird of Youth, 1962. He even played in the musical The Unsinkable Molly Brown in 1964. I remember watching a film called The 12 Angry Men. It was a film that my son Brett recommended because he was a film major, and it was a fascinating look at how a jury could flip. Ed Begley was in that movie with Henry Fonda. If you haven't watched the movie, basically they're all convinced. About 11 jurors are convinced one way, and then by the end of the film they've completely flipped. So kind of an interesting movie. So this grave is a little difficult to shoot. It's that of Jane Wyatt Ward. She was star of Father Knows Best, starring with Robert Young in the 1950s. Now, it's hard to shoot because the sun is right to its back of the marker. Jane Wyatt, who is best known as the devoted mother and wife, Margaret Anderson, on the TV series Father Knows Best with Robert Young from 1954 to 1960. Before that role, Jane had a lucrative film career during the 1930s and 40s. She lies here next to her husband, Edgar Ward. He died in 2000, the day before they were to celebrate their 65th wedding anniversary. She was one of those rare individuals who was able to juggle work and family to appear in 25 films, which included We're Only Human, 1935, Great Expectations, 1936, Girl from God's Country, 1940, Mackenzie, 1943, and None But the Lonely Heart, 1944, opposite Cary Grant and Ethel Barrymore. After Father Knows Best was over, she worked in movies and more TV. In fact, Star Trek fans will remember Jane as Mr. Spock's mother, Amanda, in a classic episode from the second season. But her last feature film role came in 1986 when she again played Manda in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. In the 1990s, she retired from show business. So sometimes you just have to save the best for last. William Frawley, Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy's show is right over here. Gosh, I don't know about you, but countless hours of fun entertainment watching him as Fred Mertz on TV back in the 1970s when I was a young kid. It's just a hilarious figure. I think the one episode that stands out as one that I remember with Fred was when they were in Italy. It was probably the episode where Lucy was stomping grapes, and I think they were riding a train, and somebody wanted to get Fred's attention. They said, "Look, there goes Gina Lola Brigida." And he goes, Where? It would be kind of easy to overlook the fact that William Frawley is buried here next to his brothers, John and Paul. They were born in 1884 and 1888, respectively. Now I'm looking for one more grave. It's that of Ritchie Valens, and I think I know where it is because of all the flowers that are on it. Over here is the grave of the legendary rock musician Ritchie Valens, who died in that famous Buddy Holly plane crash February 2nd, 1959 in Clear Lake, Iowa. He was killed, Buddy Holly was killed, J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, was killed, and the pilot named Roger Peterson were all killed. Valens is popular. He was one of rock and roll's first Latino superstars that inspired countless musicians around the world. His grave is well visited, probably the most visited grave here in the cemetery. Lots of people come by here and leave flowers and coins and all kinds of other memorabilia. And here is his mother, Concepcion or Concha Reyes Valenzuela. She died in 1987 in Watsonville, so she lived, 28 years without her son? Now, his father died in 1952, way before his son became famous. Of course, he became real popular after La Bamba came out in 1987, which was a biographical movie of his life and times. You might be curious to know that in 1990, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and in 2001, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I think that's going to wrap up our visit to the San Fernando Mission Cemetery. We want to thank you for joining us. I think a lot of you may have remembered some of you, well, maybe you learned something new, but I think this was a fascinating trip into Hollywood history.